This is the untold story of the making of the modern world. A fresh perspective, charting the spread of civilization across the globe. From the dawn of mankind and the first cities and empires, to the belief in one God. We follow the flow of civilization from the Middle East, an extraordinary place that has been a vital link between the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe for millennia. An economic, scientific, and cultural center of the world. This is an epic journey of discovery. From the east to the west. Damascus, Syria. The faithful are called to prayer at the great Umayyad Mosque.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
This is a tradition that has marked out the hours of the day in an unbroken sequence for 1,300 years. It is an appeal heard across the globe by believers in one of the world's great religions, Islam. It is testament to the enduring power of the spiritual message of the Prophet Muhammad. But it is also evidence of another tradition in Islam, its spirit of discovery and rational investigation, its embrace of science. This is the story of the forgotten contribution of medieval Islam to the history of world civilization. At the low point of European history, Muslims brought together the knowledge of the world, founded great institutions of learning, and created the foundations of modern science. The discovery of this knowledge kick-started Europe's emergence from a dark age, and it formed the basis of the revolution we call the Renaissance. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Built at the height of Europe's colonial dominance in the 19th century. Its cast gallery is filled with the ghosts of great European artworks, illustrating the West's own view of its rise to global cultural supremacy. These works mark stages in the progress of what was called Western civilization, portrayed as a humane and rational approach to art and life, which first flourished under Greece and Rome, then died out. It was rediscovered, according to Western tradition, by modern Europeans in the time we call the Rebirth or the Renaissance. This story, cherished by the West, is encapsulated in one of the most iconic images of Renaissance art.
This painting, which was done by Raphael for the Vatican originally, encapsulates everything that the Europeans thought about their Renaissance. It's called the School of Athens, and these are the great philosophers debating the meaning of life.
In this painting, great figures of the Renaissance masquerade as their ancient Greek forebears. Raphael himself plays the painter Apelles. Michelangelo appears as Heraclitus, and in the centre, Plato bears the face of Leonardo da Vinci.
One of the stories that this painting tells is that there was a direct handover of Greek culture to the European Renaissance.
It is a homage to the intellectual creativity that flourished for 1,000 years under Greece and Rome. But a millennium before Raphael's day, this so-called classical age had come crashing to an end. In the 5th century, barbarians from the north had put an end to the glory of Rome. Classical civilization in the West had been consumed by a tide of violence, plunging Europe into a dark age. The Forum, the main square of ancient Rome, where Cicero and Caesar had addressed the Roman populace, reverted to agricultural land. By Raphael's time, it was known simply as the Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture. With the fall of Rome, Western Europe had lost an entire culture of urban life, and with it, contact with the philosophy of ancient Greece. The painting illustrates the longing of Raphael's contemporaries to regain what was lost in that moment. There's no hint that anything lay between or beyond these two worlds, but ignorance. But even here, there's a clue to another story.
What's fascinating is a rather shadowy figure, almost in the corner, who's leaning over the back of Pythagoras. Now, this man was called Averroes, and he was an Islamic scholar. And he's one of the very few hints that we get of how much the Renaissance actually owed to the Islamic world.
This solitary figure stands for the crucial missing link between the classical and Renaissance worlds. In the Middle East, there was no Dark Age. There, the Romans were a blip in a much longer history of civilization. The Eastern Roman Empire fell to a dynamic new force that emerged from the Arabian desert. The invaders brought with them a new religion, Islam. Within a century, the caliphs in Damascus had made themselves masters of an empire larger than Rome's. The new Islamic world stretched from India to the west coast of Spain. Unlike the tribes that invaded Rome, these new rulers could not be called unsophisticated barbarians. In their capital, Damascus, the buildings themselves tell the story of an empire that was more concerned to develop the culture they found than to destroy it. In 706, they began work on the first great mosque in Islamic history. But they took as their starting point a structure that is one of the world's oldest sacred sites.
Years ago, this is where the mighty god Hadad was feared and was offered blood sacrifices. In the 1st century, this was a small part of the huge temple of Jupiter, which remained Temple of Jupiter until the 4th century, when this became the Cathedral of John the Baptist. And it remained so until the 8th century, when this place became the greatest mosque of the new Islamic Empire.
The Umayyad Mosque is testament to the place of Islam within a much longer story of civilization. The new mosaics and minarets were built by Christian craftsmen into the fabric of the old cathedral and pagan temple.
Just as we can see around us in the architectural evidence that this new empire didn't knock down what was there before it, but it actually built on it to a new level of sophistication, it did the same to achieve its new level of intellectual sophistication that it required.
This new religion had its own reasons for respecting and developing the knowledge of the past. In Islam, believers are taught to pray at 5 specific times a day, and so from the faith's beginning, it was very important to accurately measure the passing of time.
At the top of the minaret of the Great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, we have a beautiful sundial made by Ibn al-Shatir in the 13th century. Sundials used to adorn the courts and walls of the mosques because the time of the 5 daily prayers in Islam depended on the position of the sun in the sky. To be able to predict this, you need a sundial, such as this one.
This sundial works on a system of hours, dividing the time from sunrise till sunset, and the 24-hour system we use today, as well as indicating the times of the 5 calls to prayer. As well as determining the precise time, Muslims needed to know their exact position on Earth.
Also, you need to be able to determine the direction to Mecca, because Muslims usually will pray directing themselves towards Mecca wherever they are on the earth. So they need to do timekeeping, global positioning, based on the movements of the sun, planets, and moon.
The efforts of the people who positioned this sundial to understand the universe in scientific terms were motivated, not discouraged, by their faith in the Word of God.
It's motivated not only by its rituals and timekeeping needs, but also with its intellectual stimulations, because the Quran is full of verses that ask you to look at the sky and use your rationale to ponder the reasons behind the creation, reason why there is precise movements for the celestial bodies, the reason why there are regularities, why there is symmetry, just to think about the reason behind everything and find out yourself.
There are many passages in the Quran, for example, that tell you to look around at the world and marvel at it, but also come to understand it better, because the world is full of signs that has been made by a wise and just and merciful creator. So Muslim scientists in this medieval period thought of science as a way of studying the work of God in the world.
The arrival, 2 centuries after Rome's fall, of a new champion of rational inquiry would breathe new life into the dormant tradition of ancient philosophy.
The Arab rulers were very interested in not only preserving the culture and the learning in particular, and with a certain emphasis on scientific learning of the areas that they'd taken over, but they wanted to gather this information together. beginning with the Abbasids in Baghdad.
In 750, the Abbasid dynasty founded a new city on the banks of the Tigris. They called it Medinat Salem, but it was instantly known by its local name, Baghdad. It was built on a perfectly circular plan, centering on the glorious palace of the Caliph. Around it grew the greatest city of the age.
If I had to live in the 8th century, I'd want to live in Baghdad. That was the most exciting place. It's where the action was. It's the center of the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And there's a huge amount of money being poured into creating culture, learning, building a new city. It must have been fabulously exciting.
That city survives today only in the buildings it inspired elsewhere, like the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Egypt. It hints at the opulence of what was once a cosmopolitan metropolis, which drew in talent from around the world.
You have Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Sabian, and other scholars all working together. Different schools of thought were able to work together in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom, which enabled them to produce something new.
Scholars were drawn in from around the empire and beyond by the desire of the Abbasid dynasty and their courtiers to create an intellectual culture that rivaled the empires of the past. At its epicenter was the royal library known evocatively as the House of Wisdom. The building itself has long since vanished. But fortunately, evidence for its contents survives 3,000 miles away to the west. In the archives of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, manuscripts survive which reveal how the scholars of Baghdad helped save Greek knowledge from oblivion.
Looking at a copy of Euclid's Elements, this is one of the most revolutionary works in the history of mathematics, and it was written by Euclid in ancient Greece around the time of Aristotle and Plato. If you look through it, you can see that it's, of course, full of diagrams, being a book about geometry. And for other ancient Greek authors, and even down to the current day, the Elements sets out a kind of model of science, a kind of science where you build up from these first principles. The interesting thing about this copy of the Elements, though, is that it's not in Greek, it's in Arabic. This is a medieval manuscript, and it's a copy of a translation of Euclid's Elements into Arabic that was made in the 9th century as part of a huge translation movement in which works of Greek science and philosophy were translated into Arabic in Baghdad under the Abbasid caliphs.
Under the patronage of the Abbasid rulers in Baghdad, a systematic process began by which the great works of Greek philosophy were sought out and translated into Arabic. This was an unprecedented move by one culture to absorb en masse the wisdom of another.
The translation movement, of which this copy of the Elements was such an important part, was absolutely massive. So it included texts from pretty much every area of Greek literary endeavor, obviously mathematics, but also, for example, astronomy, works on music, and also, of course, philosophy. So if you wanted to read the works of, say, Aristotle or Ptolemy or Galen or Euclid in the 9th century, mostly you could not do it in Europe. Most of the activity in science and philosophy was going on in the Arabic-speaking world, and especially in Baghdad at this time. You have to imagine a fairly diffused and complex set of groups spread out across not only Baghdad, but the whole, what we would call Middle East. And all of these groups would have been discussing what for them were the hot topics of the day, which meant things like Aristotelian metaphysics and Galen's views on medicine.
The translators of Baghdad were doing nothing less than creating a new language of world knowledge. The philosophy of Aristotle, Galen's revolutionary work on medicine, Ptolemy's astronomy, Euclid's elements, and Pythagoras' geometry would now be texts the world read not in Greek, but in Arabic. And Baghdad didn't live on Greek wisdom alone. Syriac Christians, Zoroastrians from Persia, and even followers of ancient paganism all contributed ideas. From India, the Arabs learnt the modern system of numbers and new information on the paths of the stars. The translation movement condensed the knowledge of the globe into a single language which could be read and studied from Spain to India. As time went on, the centralized authority of Baghdad began to devolve to new centers of power, each with its own emir or caliph, and with it went this new culture of learning. In 909, the new Fatimid dynasty came to power in Egypt. Within a century, they had built a new city on the banks of the Nile. Quickly, Cairo became one of the great cities of the Arab world. At the heart of this bustling new city, the Fatimids built the Al-Azhar Mosque. But this was not just a place of prayer. This was a purpose-built institution dedicated to the education of the people. This is a place that calls itself proudly the oldest university in the world.
One of the biggest prayer halls in Al-Azhar. Here, people would normally pray during prayer times at columns like this, for instance. Throughout the medieval period, you'd see professors sitting and having circles of students around them. They would explain particular subjects or give lectures on particular source books. We would have normally the most advanced students sitting in closest to the professor, and then the less advanced students. And all these lectures were open to the public. Anyone could walk in from the street and just sit in there and listen to the professor.
At the feet of these columns sat some of the greatest minds of their time.
Students would choose the professors they want, who taught different subjects ranging from the law, Quran, jurisprudence, philosophy, mathematics. And some of these professors were very popular, that we'd have larger crowds coming from the streets and larger number of students sitting. They would have to sit on higher places in order to make themselves heard to all these crowds.
The foundation of Al-Azhar by the new rulers of Egypt set the tone for a flourishing of rival centers of learning in the new competing courts of the Muslim world.
This became part of the political competition between different sovereigns throughout the Middle East during this period. It's a sort of a pattern that kept repeating with all these new small kingdoms or principalities or new empires where rulers and sovereigns and even rich people and big generals would build mosques, madrasas, and in order to allow for teaching and for and they would host and sponsor scholars to come and teach in their schools.
Across the Muslim world, madrasas and universities sprang up to rival Al-Azhar. In Fez, Morocco, the Qarawiyyin University was the first, and it gave birth to a whole university town with smaller institutions of learning, many of them architectural wonders, like the Bouhanania Madrasa. The madrasa's every surface bears witness to the intellectual sophistication of those times.
أنا مجلس العلم فأحلل به تكون كيف شئت ابدأ عالمة وانظمها وألهنها وحصنها وحرزها وثبت وأوفى فضلا وعمر نداين حتى كملت القصيدة على طول عرض المدرسة كانت ودخل بها حتى المسجد لداخل وجاء آخر ديالها هو هذا.
The Bouhanania Madrasa housed and fed students for free until as recently as the 1960s. It was part of an enduring and international culture of scholarship. The Islamic world in the Middle Ages represented a massive free trade zone in which scholars at the courts of different rulers and the universities they founded could exchange and review each other's ideas, with spectacular results. This was an environment which did more than just preserve and pass on the works of ancient philosophy.
The Arab civilization didn't just serve as a freezer for the Greek civilization. With their interest in this knowledge in astronomy and mathematics, they were able to, come up with new things. They were creative people.
From the beginnings of the translation movement, the scholars of the Arab world were generating revolutionary new ideas.
As soon as the scientific works were being received into the Arabic language, immediately you find scholars building on those works and coming up with their own ideas. So you have mathematicians coming up with new proofs and proving things that had never been proven before. You have doctors immediately going beyond what they found in Hippocrates and Galen, and you have philosophers who are devising their own philosophical ideas.
The new world of Arab philosophy would produce a new kind of intellectual with a distinctive approach to learning. These were men whose research was not confined to the library. One of the men who taught at the columns of Al-Azhar was Ibn al-Haytham, known to the West as Al-Hazan. He is the founding genius of the modern science of optics, the man who first demonstrated the key properties of light.
I can demonstrate this here differently using this glass tube. You're going to be able to see that the light travels through this tube in a straight line and is escaping here and hitting the screen at this point.
This basic truth, that light travels in straight lines, was first proven by Ibn al-Haytham. He also established rules of the process we call reflection.
This tube is reflective, so the rail of light is now reflected to hit the other side of the tube here again and again and again, zigzagging its way out. If I change the angle, you can see the light still traveling in a straight line, hitting this end here, and then bouncing to hit this edge here and then bounce back again, zigzagging its way through this tube. Zigzagging through this tube is exactly what happens to the light inside an optical cable.
Ibn al-Haytham developed his theory of optics into a holistic vision of how human beings see. He conducted a brilliant experiment to which he gave the name Al-Bayt al-Mudlim, which means dark room, or in Latin, camera obscura.
We have a beautiful view of a nice church just outside the window here. Now, if I close these blinds, turning this into a dark room, and through this pinhole I created in this blind, I'll be able to capture an image of this church on this transparent screen. However, it's an inverted image. As Ibn al-Haytham explained and demonstrated, is that the light reflected from the bell tower of this church is going to travel in a straight line diagonally through the pinhole to hit the bottom of the screen, whereas the light traveling from the bottom of the church is going to reflect and travel in a straight line through the pinhole to hit the top of the screen. You know, if I let this eye look through this pinhole, I'm going to be able to see the image of the church again, invert it back on the retina of this eye.
The brilliance of Ibn al-Haytham was to see that this was the secret to the workings of the human eye. This was due to his unique methodology. By positing a theory, testing it with experiments, then publishing results, al-Haytham and his colleagues in the Arab world had taken what the Greeks called natural philosophy and changed it into something different, something that was starting to resemble what we call science.
He carried a huge amount of experiments to prove the things that many people thought they're obvious. He wanted to establish everything experimentally before moving on to the next stage, which is very close to the modern way we practice science. So he's actually one of the founders of the modern scientific approach.
Ibn al-Haytham was part of a scientific revolution that emerged from the mosques and madrasas of the Islamic world. Islamic scientists effectively invented modern chemistry, giving us the words alchemy, alembic, alcohol, and alkali. Physicians like Ibn Nafis and the great Avicenna wrote works which remained canonical until the 19th century. The Arabs invented astronomical instruments which would eventually guide Europeans to the New World. And they measured the circumference of the Earth and mapped its surface with an unprecedented accuracy. An atmosphere of ideas and invention pervaded society from India to the west of Spain. It was only a matter of time before it came to the notice of Europeans. In the year 1000, Christian Europe was a culture at a crossroads, a society beginning to emerge from a dark age, but still centuries from the self-confidence of the Renaissance. Its scholars remained cloistered in monasteries, restricted to a very limited intellectual diet.
The work that we have in front of us is what's called in Latin De Temporum Ratione, on the reasoning of times. And it is devoted to working out the times of the church festivals, in particular Easter.
This work represents the cutting edge of European astronomy at the turn of the millennium. But compared to what was happening in the Middle East, it was hopelessly limited.
What it doesn't have is anything theoretical. There's no theoretical astronomy here. He doesn't tell you about the course of the sun or the moon through the heavens, and he doesn't talk about the planets or the fixed stars at all.
The problem for European authors was the tiny corpus of source material they had to draw on, compared to the libraries of the Islamic world.
We're talking about rather small libraries. I mean, if a cathedral has a library of 100 books, that's a large number. And when you compare this, for example, with the contemporary library in Cordova, which, according to reputation, had 80,000 volumes, this is minuscule number of books.
European thought was separated by a vast chasm from the vibrant world of Islamic science. It was a gulf that would be spanned in the most unlikely way. In 1095, Christian knights set out on the first of centuries of holy wars against Islam. For 200 years, Christianity and Islam were religions at war. But ironically, this new contact was also bringing the two faiths closer together. In the wake of the warriors and monks of the First Crusade came another kind of pilgrim.
It seems as if there were other people joining the Crusades who were just very fascinated about new avenues, new opportunities which were being offered on an intellectual level.
Christian scholars came back from the Crusades with a fascinating glimpse into the wisdom of the Arabs. But it was not so much in the Holy Land as in the contested regions of southern Europe that first contacts evolved into a steady flow of ideas. The Crusades were aimed not only at Jerusalem, but also at Sicily and Spain.
There are a number of different points of contact. Perhaps the areas where you see the most, or the greatest amount of, say, transmission of knowledge, transmission of culture, would be in areas like Sicily or Spain, where first you have a Muslim society that then is, reconquered or replaced by a Christian authority, and they absorb a lot of what had been left behind.
In Spain, a world of intricate design, luxury and sophistication awaited, which in the 11th century, Christians were only starting to discover. Its palaces survive as monuments to Islamic wisdom that can literally be read like a book. Each surface bears the trace of some philosophical idea or geometrical theorem. But the historical tide was starting to turn. In 1085, an event occurred that would affect world history forever. The Christian king Alfonso VI entered the frontier city of Toledo.
Esta es la puerta conocida en Toledo como Puerta Vieja de Bisagra, o también conocida como la Puerta de Alfonso VI, porque según la tradición, Alfonso VI, el rey castellano-leonés que conquistó Toledo, entró por esta puerta en la ciudad, ¿no?
This moment marked the beginning of the end for Muslim Spain. but it signified a new dawn for the intellectual life of Christian Europe. When he entered Toledo, Alfonso found books in quantities that astounded Christian eyes.
De manera que cuando Alfonso VI ocupa la ciudad, muy posiblemente algunos musulmanes tenían sus bibliotecas y tenían sus libros, ¿no? A los cuales se podían añadir otros que viniesen de otras zonas de Al-Ándalus, que muchos de ellos eran, a su vez, traducciones que habían hecho los árabes de obras clásicas, del mundo clásico, que nos remontan pues, a Grecia, a toda la filosofía griega y demás.
Tending these books was a literate population of Jews, Christians and Muslims who knew both Arabic and Spanish.
Entonces aquí en Toledo vamos a tener, digamos, esos dos elementos importantes, ¿no? Es decir, libros que se pueden conocer, que se pueden leer, porque hay gente que sabe leerlos, ¿no? Y lo fundamental, claro, es que una vez que los lean, los puedan traducir.
After 1085, Toledo became the center of a massive process of translation of Arabic works into Latin. Scholars, frustrated by the restrictions of European learning, flooded to Toledo to read for themselves the famed works of the Arab masters.
Daniel of Morley, who knows Adelard's works very well, he tells of a story of going to Paris and finding that the scholars there are exceedingly boring because all they do, they have very big manuscripts in front of them and they're making little annotations in the margin. These manuscripts, in fact, seem to be works of law. And so he says, I went to Toledo because I heard that they studied the quadrivium there, maths, astronomy, arithmetic, and I was not disappointed. Obviously, it was very exciting for him. And he wrote a book describing his experiences in Toledo and saying how much more clearly the Arabs explained things than did the Latins.
An event of historic significance was unfolding in Toledo. The long-forgotten works of the Greek philosophers and the masterpieces of Arab science were starting to materialize in the West. As scholars returned home from Toledo, they brought with them this priceless wisdom. The impact was immediate and obvious. A society which until recently had lain in the Dark Ages began to construct a brand new culture of its own. 800 miles from Toledo, in the west of England, traces have been found of the influence of Muslims on Europe's re-emergence. In Salisbury Cathedral, symbols have been discovered which are blandly familiar to us today, but in 13th century Europe were a new and exotic Eastern import.
This is a 3 written on a beam, a roof beam, which we know was put up round about 1240, just after 1240. As far as we know, this is the first use of a Hindu-Arabic numeral in an architectural context. And if we look at the neighboring beams, we will see here a 2. And on the next beam, there's a 4. And on the other side, too, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 marked, but with an N after each numeral, which suggests that those are the north beams. So these numerals were put up by the carpenters in order to indicate the order in which the beams should be placed.
This numbering system, in which 9 numerals were complemented by a 0, which you could add to 1, to create 10, 100, and infinite possibilities beyond, was invented in India and adopted by the Arabs in the 8th century. Its flexibility and ease of use amazed Europeans.
When people became aware of these Hindu-Arabic numerals and their potential, the fact that they had place value, the fact that there was a single number for a single meaning, with a single meaning, it was natural that they should use them instead of the Roman numerals, which are much more cumbersome, where you need 3 or 4 strokes for each numeral and so on.
These numbers themselves were only the tip of an iceberg of new ideas which entered Europe at this time, and allowed Europeans to build cathedrals of the scale and grandeur of Salisbury.
It's nice to think that they were used alongside or in conjunction with much more advanced mathematical techniques actually applied to the building of a Gothic cathedral such as Salisbury Cathedral, which in itself is based on much more rigorous mathematical planning than earlier cathedrals.
Cathedrals like Salisbury tell in themselves the story of Europe's adoption of Islamic wisdom. They were both the centres of learning where ideas first penetrated and the places where those ideas were turned into stone.
And so one can think of the whole cathedral community, the architects, the builders, the carpenters, and the scholars, the teachers, the clerics, all being part of an intellectual movement which indeed owes a lot to Arabic science.
Under the influence of the Arabs, scientific thought was starting to infiltrate Europe's ecclesiastical centres of learning. In the process, they were starting to evolve into something else. Across Europe, institutions were founded on the principles of secular learning inspired by the Arabs. They were called universities. Europe was waking up from its intellectual slumbers, fed by the sheer quantity and range of works coming in from Toledo. The works that more than any other would transform European thought were the translations from Arabic of the long-lost writings of Aristotle.
The works of the Greek philosopher Aristotle were fundamentally important to the university movement because Aristotle dealt with things like rationale and reason and logic and proof of your argument.
These concepts would form the basis of Western Europe's transformation into a civilization based on rational inquiry. But to decipher the works of Aristotle, Western Europeans would need the guidance of the people who had done it before.
There's a problem with Aristotle because actually his works are immensely complicated and you often need help understanding them and interpreting them.
The work that guided Europeans through their first struggles with Aristotle was the work of the Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, known to the West as Averroes.
What happened at the same time as these translations were being made in Toledo was that Averroes, not so far away, in Cordova, in Islamic Spain, was writing commentaries on Aristotle's works. Aristotle was always regarded as being difficult to understand and very laconic, missing things out. He needed interpretation. And Averroes somehow understood Aristotle better than anybody else.
So if you'd been in any university in Europe in the Renaissance, then the students would have had Aristotle in one hand and the commentary of Averroes in the other. In fact, he wasn't called Averroes often, he was known simply as the commentator.
Averroes was only the greatest of a pantheon of Islamic scholars to whom the Europeans turned to understand the new sciences they were beginning to study. Under their influence, Europe was becoming a different kind of place. As the 12th became the 13th, then 14th century, Europe discovered a new curiosity and dynamism. The reconquest of Spain was completed just as Europe discovered a new world across the Atlantic. The world's center of gravity was moving west. The place that symbolizes this era more than any still has the power to astound. Millions of people visit Florence to celebrate a city where European civilization finally came of age. This was the city of Dante and Petrarch, of Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli. A place where new ideas were being forged that would take Europe out of the Middle Ages. Traditionally, the inspiration for this is thought to have come from ancient Greece and Rome. But even at this defining moment, the Renaissance masters were still standing on the shoulders of the giants of Muslim philosophy. This debt to Muslim learning extended even to the greatest scientific discovery of the era. Nicholas Copernicus is the man to whom we owe the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe.
In this book, Copernicus believed that the Sun is at the center and all the planets, but the Moon, orbit the Sun.
His theory rested on a particular diagram which explained why planets sometimes seem to move not in circles, but in straight lines.
There is a first circle and a second circle which center is moving around the first one, and the planet is moving on the circumference of the second circle, and the combination is a motion along the diameter of this device.
This diagram explains what is essentially an optical illusion, that one circle moving within another circle appears to be moving up and down a straight line. Copernicus believed this is what we saw when we observed the planets.
So this is a mathematical, geometrical device that Copernicus uses several times inside the books for explaining the precession of the equinoxes, for instance, but also for explaining part of the model of Mercury.
The diagram showing the movement of Mercury was only one of many times Copernicus used this device to explain the solar system. But extraordinarily, it appears that this utterly crucial idea was not Copernicus's own. It already existed in the Muslim world.
This is the so-called Al-Tusi couple, because it was already conceived by an astronomer in the 13th century that was an Arabic astronomer that was called Al-Tusi.
Al-Tusi was an Islamic astronomer based in Iran. If you put his diagram side by side with that of Copernicus, the debt of the European scientist to Al-Tusi becomes clear.
It is an open question if Copernicus knew something about the Islamic astronomer or not. But what is certain is the model of the planets are very similar to those of the Arabic astronomer, just changing the position of the Earth and the Sun.
This discovery reveals that our modern vision of the solar system owes a crucial debt to centuries of astronomical work by Islamic scientists. It is only one of a host of Islamic ideas on which the European Renaissance was based. It was not just the substance of science that the Renaissance learnt from Muslims. It was the philosophy that lay behind it. Copernicus's discovery was immediately controversial, as it contradicted the teachings of the Church that the Earth was the centre of the universe. The clashes that followed have come to define a conception of secular rationalism that the West regards as peculiarly its own. But this too had an Islamic precedent.
There'd been famous debates in Europe about the validity of secular and religious thought and whether those two could run along together, whether you could have scientific and philosophical exploration and also believe in God. But actually, these are already arguments that have been played out in the Islamic world.
Averroes was not only a commentator on Aristotle, he was also the man who taught Western science how to face down conservative opposition.
So there are two paths to real knowledge, one through rational thought and one through divine revelation. And he met quite a bit of resistance from the Muslim authorities.
Averroes's arguments in his defense were used by the scholars of the first European universities to justify the study of natural philosophy.
Averroes's argument is very simple. He says that philosophy is the search for the truth, and that if God is true, the two can exist side by side. Now, his ideas were immensely influential in the West for centuries after, and they were used when people were trying to justify religious and secular learning existing side by side.
The Europeans of the Middle Ages had discovered in the philosophers of the Muslim world pioneers of an idea that still shapes the modern world, that the universe can be understood through reason, without harm to religion. Perhaps the opponents of Averroes should have listened to the words of one Christian translator. Of course God rules the universe, but we may and should inquire into the natural world. The Arabs teach us that.